Speaking of voices, one of, one of, you know, what?
Okay.
One of the things that really helped, I mean, getting sober doesn't happen overnight. It sort of happens in waves. Like, 2 years before you did, you knew. So there's things that helped us to get sober back in the day. One of them was reading books about positivity and consciousness and like the law of attraction and positive affirmations that we say to ourselves and writing them down and saying them into a mirror. We did that for a while, and I think it really helped us. I'm asking you this because in the documentary, you found it very difficult to say positive affirmations to like love yourself. It was really hard for you then. Is that something you ever do now?
I don't do that now. Like at the time, I did a lot of that stuff. It was sort of like, when I was losing when I was, trying to lose all the weight, and I thought that was the problem. When I was involved with the film, I was 300 pounds or thereabouts. The thing about affirmations and all those things, they help. They certainly. I consider them to be like an adjunct, right? It's not the same. This is where one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic has where you start to see the value, because you start to communicate in shorthand. Like the bullshit meter is right there. You recognize right away, and the other person also knows that So there's a tendency it opens up a portal for some honesty. An affirmation won't do that. So like to me the secret, like, if you're not an alcoholic or, if you're not an addict and you're not trying to get sober, I think, they're great. But if you're an addict trying to get sober, I don't think the secret's going to help you. I don't think that standing in front of a mirror saying something, saying some affirmation isn't going to help you. What helped me was admitting to somebody that, just coming clean, like, I'm an alcoholic, and and my life is unmanageable, and I don't know what to do. And what in retrospect, what I think I did was I borrowed somebody else's consciousness, because my best thinking landed me either behind a police car, in a hospital, or in jail. And that was my best thinking got me to those places. When I was sitting in the back of a police car, that was my best thinking.
Right.
One might say, well, you could think better than that. Well, no, not really. Not at that moment. That was my best thinking, and I had to change my thinking. And I can't think my way out of that. I have to be guided.
Surrender.
All of that.
Yeah, all of that.
Surrender really, and people have a real big problem. I've noticed, especially when I've worked with people, like certainly it's like if I did anything at a VA where there's like a whole bunch of soldiers, and the notion of surrender is so counter to that thinking.
Yeah.
And what I would tell them is, okay, well, let's look at it differently. How about ceasing the argument with reality?
Yeah.
And there's no arrival point.
Right.
It's just, the deeper you go, the deeper you go. Like I love this saying, the closer you get to the light, the longer the shadow,
Yeah, that's true.
So you gotta, but it does get easier.
Yeah.
And the view gets better.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you don't come up against stuff. You do.
Yeah.
There's always stuff coming up for you. And
it's exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, you get sober, you have some spiritual awakening or consciousness awakening, and it doesn't mean that you're arrived. I'm 44, you're 71, and I love, at this point I can talk to younger people, and they're like, oh, they're going through a bunch of stuff, and especially in Sedona, it's like, yeah, I can't wait for my Saturn return to be over. I'm like, do you think that's it?
Oh, Mercury must be in retrograde.
You think as soon as you're like 30 years old, you're gonna have some like shit figured out? Well, maybe, but guess what? Like, there's a whole lifetime of stuff still gonna come up. It's like a daily practice,
Right. It's just, but it's the way you look at it. You know that. It's
absolutely, yes.
It's a matter of perspective. I mean, the way you see something now. When I worked at a rehab once, and they did a really great thing. So in the morning, there's a morning meeting and everybody checks in, right? There's like, say, 40 people, and they, and they just give a brief overview of where they're at that moment. But they give them, they printed out a list of emotions, right? Happy, sad, glad, resent, but like, and there was like a bunch of them, like 20 of them. And I thought that was really helpful because one of the things I had to learn how to do was to identify what I was feeling, right? And because most people, and myself included, were used to a aggravated reactivity rather than a contemplative response or contemplative responding. So I was like, ready, right, and that would overtake everything, and to get to a point where you can actually pause and then have a response rather, contemplative response. I mean, it's a practice. And so when people come into rehabs, it's not, nobody comes in on a roll, right? And so, they're a mess no matter how they look, but inside they're a mess. But this list I thought was really helpful because it begins the process of defining what's going on, right?
So yeah, like self-reflection,
right?
Self-inquiry,
exactly.
Contemplation,
right?
Instead of reactivity,
but meaningful. Not
meaningful.
Going in there and immediately, setting minds up, where your internal landscape is a minefield. Which is what it felt like to me. I was terrified of going in there. I was either afraid it was going to be total shit or worse, nothing. That everything about me was a lie. That there was no redeeming value in anything within my being. And I really believed that for a long time. So introspection became very difficult because when you're drinking, that's the last thing that you're doing. You're not doing any of that at all. You're not doing any kind of meaningful self-reflection. You're either aggrandizing, like as I like to say, I was either on my way to my coronation or on my way to my execution. I was never on my way to work.
Yeah, I resonate with that in a lot of ways. Just one of them that comes to mind is oftentimes I'd find myself like after a few beers, I would start imagining all the great things that I could do in life and really believing. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, oh yeah, I can see myself doing that, like for sure. And I would get kind of high off of that until after maybe the 5th or 6th or 7th beer. And then I just get too tired to think about that anymore. And
right.
Just get into whatever kind of slump.
Well, thank you. Well, using robs us of our best intentions. One time I was like, I got really into, I wanted to take flying lessons, like fucking flying lessons. But anyway, I really wanted to do it, right? And anyway, that night I went to the bar and I was going to talk about it. So happens I met a pilot. So we talked about flying for like all night. And Coke came out and, we talked about flying till 3:00 in the morning. Well, that's all I needed. I was done. I got my flying experience.
Yeah.
And so it robs us of our best intentions.
Yeah.
Really, it robs us of meaningful relationships. It prevents us from really engaging in really significant relationships that we desperately need to sustain our soul. And I don't saying that from a religious standpoint. But my juice comes from interacting with people.